This is the reading of chapter 12, Lester Sumrall's book, My Story to His Glory. Please do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Get me to 1,000 subscribers. Also, if you want to say thanks for helping put you through Bible school, that's the way. Chapter 12, The Land of Spies and Suspicion. What is your occupation? Minister, sir. Minister of what? Minister of religion. Ah, yes. Well, that's a different matter. It was in the Russian consulate in Harbin, Manchuria, that this crisply punctuated conversation took place. Howard Carter and I, seeking a transit visa to cross into Siberia and the USSR and on into Poland. Our passports were in order, but the consul didn't quite understand the word minister. When we explained that we were involved in missionary work, he stated, well, we will have to wire Moscow to get special permission for you to pass through the Soviet Union. The reply may take as long as 2 or 3 weeks, and it will cost you $18. This was a little more than exasperating. It called for our holy anger. What? I said. I was outraged. Do you mean that just because we're ministers of the gospel, we can't travel as ordinary tourists? Yeah. You'll have to have a special permit from Moscow. This is our land, he answered. But why? Are we criminals evading justice or something? No, he said, only that you are preachers. We explained that we had special engagements in the country and that time was of the essence. We couldn't afford to lose any days. Besides that, I added, we have already bought our tickets to Poland. He assured us he would do the best that he could and would add the word urgent. Maybe the answer will come in 4 or 5 days, he stated weakly. We thanked him for his help and assured him that we appreciated his kindness. But by the day of our scheduled departure, there was no response. We had to stay put, and now our anger was joined by growing frustration. The visas arrived the following day, but as the Trans-Siberian trains ran only every 4 days, we had to send a telegram to Poland and postpone the meetings. Finally, February 17, 1936, we were allowed to board the Chinese Eastern Railroad Northwest train to Manchuria, the Siberian Front Station. There we transferred to the single-track Trans-Siberian Railway for the 5,800-mile, 9-day ride on the loneliest railroad route in the world. Our transfers were accepted, however, only after a scrutinizing customs examination to be certain we had no religious or political tracts to distribute. As soon as we crossed the border into Siberia, our belongings were again searched and passports and tickets taken into custody, leaving us with no identification. From that time on, we were under surveillance day and night by special guards. What we saw through the frosty windows of the train can never be erased from my memory. The first thing that attracted my attention was a large crimson-colored flag hoisted above the station in the wilds of Siberia, where we stopped the following morning. It gently moved in the breeze, but I knew its gentle movement was not characteristic of what the flag signified. Then I noticed 3 large portraits hanging where they couldn't be missed in the station. The hard expressions on the faces of Stalin in the center and Lenin and Marx on the sides. In the Siberian wilderness, the temperature dips at times to 50 below zero. Not only was it bitterly cold outside, but we were also to sense the coldness of the hearts of the officials with whom we had to brush shoulders from time to time with. Around the station were a number of poorly clad people with expressions of privation and depression written across their faces. About the village were a number of small log cabins. We passed a crew of logmen working by the railway, and we could see their faces distinctly, faces lined with fatigue, showing the stress to which they were subjected. To one side stood a well-dressed soldier with his rifle, watching the crew work. No doubt it was a camp of exiled men, suffering terrible hardship. These Siberian prison camps, we had been told, were literally prisons, for the living dead, hollow-eyed, ragged creatures loading and unloading the trains. Some of them were guarded by armed men with vicious dogs. We observed how hard communism was on the women. 90% of the snow diggers and railway yard workers were poorly clad, haggard-looking women. At every station we saw the red flag, the portraits of their pitiless oppressors, and the same pathetic-looking people. We saw hundreds of little dugouts and caves, which we assumed were the homes for these depressed and oppressed men and women. I saw more snow than I had ever seen before in my young life. It is no wonder that Siberia is referred to as a land of frozen wastes. And it is no wonder that the Tsars and the dictators of Russia have sent millions of their enemies and criminals to these cold and isolated parts of this dreary country. There is no way they could escape and live to tell about it. I couldn't help but wonder how many of these exiles people were Christian brothers and sisters who had been banished to live on their days here because of their faith. Aboard the train was the in-tourist interpreter for the aid of the English-speaking passengers. As we asked him about the general conditions of Russia, some of his answers sound truthful, but many of them didn't. We were told that the economic situation was better than it had ever been before, that the collective fanners and the peasant population had enough food and clothing, that the manufacturing was growing by leaps and bounds, and that since they had abolished the stock exchange at that time, the gold ruble was stabilized and the profiteering had been eliminated, thereby giving more money to the common people. Russia, at the time, was preparing for the greatest war in history, but we, of course, didn't know this. We asked about religious conditions and were told, no one is forbidden to pray or worship God. The interpreter could not or would not explain why we had been delayed and treated as we had been at the Russian Foreign Affairs Office. Many years have passed since our trip through the Siberian wastelands, and the interim information has seeped out into the Western world about what it's like to be arrested and sent away. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was instrumental in opening many eyes to the brutality and the horrors of concentration camps. He spoke of arrest as a breaking point in your life, a bolt of lightning which has scored a direct hit on you, an unassimilable spiritual earthquake not every person can cope with, as a result of which people often slip into insanity. In Moscow, the Mecca of socialism, the Jerusalem of communism, we had about 5-hour wait. So we asked the tourist official about a sightseeing tour. He told us that a trip to the places that would permit us to visit would take about an hour by taxi and cost 35 rubles. We were driven past the large hotels and business houses of the city, owned and operated by the government, there not being a privately owned place of business in Russia. We were shown the great opera, cinema, and theater houses where the Soviets gather and attempt to enjoy their plays and films depicting Russian communist glory. Next, our guide showed us the large apartment houses for government employees. Then we came to the Soviet Square and the Statue of Liberty, where the guide said the Great Revolution of 1917 started. We were then taken to the famous Red Square, where we saw Lenin's red marble mausoleum and his body embalmed in a glass casket. This is the place where blood ran down the streets in the horrible revolution when the Tsar was driven from power. Red Square is the scene of a huge May Day parade every year in honor of working people. We saw the ancient and artistic edifice of old St. Basil's Church, which at one time was a place of worship, but is now used as a museum. The architecture of old Russia is represented by many colored onion-shaped domes like those of St. Basil's Church. We asked about these old churches and were told that they are now used as cabarets, clubs, museums, and anything that has to do with profit or pleasure for the Communist Party. We saw the Grand Kremlin Palace, the meeting place of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, Russia's parliament. The structure of the Soviet government, like that of its Communist Party, resembled a pyramid. But it has long been known that the people who run the Communist Party run Russia. At the time we passed through Russia during the mid-30s, the people were living under extreme terror. The secret police were arresting millions of Russians suspected of having anti-communist views or participating in anti-government activities. These victims were either shot or sent to the prison camps. Many of these people had openly opposed Stalin's policies during the mid-1950s. In order to crush this opposition, Stalin began a program called the Great Purge. It was that, indeed, as great terror spread across the land. Millions of people were arrested by the secret police. Even family members spied on each other. Fear and suspicion spread throughout the nation. We were there right at this time. We noticed a marked difference between the dress of the soldiers and the government officials and that of the ordinary people on the street. The government employees were well dressed. The common people had the old Russian felt boots to their knees and wore shabby, worn-looking clothes. But on their faces they wore what was even more heartbreaking, forlorn looks of misery. The communists were doing everything possible to discourage religious practices throughout their propaganda and educational efforts. The Russian Orthodox Church was the official Russian church before the communists rose to power, but the communists destroyed or confiscated most of the churches. Many church leaders were killed and others were imprisoned. In spite of present-day propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union, which would indicate that churches today have reopened and people are allowed to worship freely. Religious life in Russia is not all that you and I are accustomed to. We acquired a Moscow newspaper presented in English. Not surprisingly, it was full of communist activities and propaganda. One article struck us forcibly as we felt it depicted the sentiment of those who had sold out to the Communist Party. We will live for communism and we will die for communism. My heart swelled within me in a sort of holy zeal. How much more should we, as the followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, live for him and, by his all-sufficient grace and mercy, die for him if need be. What a relief it was to reboard our train and continue west. What a relief to leave this land of spies and suspicion. What a pleasure to pass over the Russian border into a God-fearing country. As we neared the border, our tickets and passports were returned. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we arrived in Stolbs, the Polish border city. From there, Carter and I caught the next train to the city of Lodz by way of Warsaw, arriving at 2 the next morning. Very tired and having heard the clacking and shrieking of locomotive wheels, for more than 9 days, we were now relieved to break the journey. It was good to be met by Christians and to know that we would be enjoying the warm fellowship of our beloved Polish Christians and brethren.